The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute 2022 Fellow, Michele Norris Johnson.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. This is the last of our conversations, and we're going to tackle what looks like a pretty straightforward sentence. What does a productive conversation about race sound like? I'm not going to answer that question for you today, but hopefully, as we talk about this, you'll get a better sense of how to answer that question and when to ask that question, or whether it's even worth asking that question. So if I just ask you now, before we even talk about it, what does a productive conversation about race sound like? Anyone?
One that includes all races.
One that includes all races. Okay, let's build on that. Anybody else?
One that includes like all talking points, all viewpoints.
Okay, all races, all viewpoints. Anybody else?
A lot of active listening.
A lot of active listening. Anybody else?
No interrupting.
No interruptions. That's interesting. So let's start with that. And let's ask some questions. And the way I like to think about this is, what if we took the question itself and picked it apart? Every single one of those words. What does a productive conversation about race sound like? As a journalist, I'm often interested in who, what, where, when, and why. And we're going to get to that at the end. Who, what, where, when, and why. But we're starting with the what. So if you just begin with what does a productive conversation sound like, what are the parameters for that conversation? So we've heard a couple things. No interruptions, all kinds of viewpoints, all kinds of people. But conversation, we're going to get to that in a minute, because what does a productive conversation sound like? So first, let's begin with the formality of that conversation. I don't know, do we have people online with us? Do we know if anybody? Okay, so for folks online, as we are asking questions, because there's going to be a lot of questions that are thrown out around this core question, we'd like you to participate if you can by sharing your thoughts in the chat, and we'll make sure that we try to incorporate some of that in our conversation as well. So when we think about a conversation about race, oftentimes we think of it being somewhat of a formal conversation. It happens on a Tuesday, you're invited to attend, sometimes you're mandated to attend, you have a job and there's diversity training, you attend a university and there's a session that you have to go through, you have to sit through a half hour, you have to follow the prompts, you get a certificate at the end, you have to send that to your superior, to your RA, to your professor, to show that you participated in that conversation. And it is deemed to be productive, what? Because you finished it, because you completed it, you got the certificate. Is that necessarily productive? So productive is going to be one of these words we interrogate and examine also. So conversation and productive. But first, let's begin with the idea of what it is. Is a conversation on social media that flows out of a slap at the Oscars, a question about a coach saying something to a player, a political debate. Is that a conversation? Even though all the people who are included are vectored all over the country and maybe all over the world, would that be included in the so-called conversation? Would a conversation that happens on the side of a soccer field, parents standing, coaches standing, players standing next to each other, having some sort of rapport, would that be considered a conversation? People in an elevator, is that a conversation? So when you think about that word, what does that actually mean? Who's included? Does it include church sermons, theater? When someone writes a song and they include lyrics that invite you to think about strange fruit hanging from a tree, is that a conversation? Now, whoever wrote that is in conversation with someone because they put words on paper. Does that contribute to our conversation, or is that the conversation in itself? When someone writes a poem and they say, I too sing America, is that a conversation? Or do we have too narrow a definition of what a conversation is? And if the conversation is too narrow, do we also have too narrow a parameter in determining what is actually productive? If someone is standing on a street corner with a sign held high over their head. If you lived in Washington over many years, there used to be a gentleman who would stand at the corner across from the observatory. You know exactly what I'm talking about. He was an older man and he held a sign up that made you so uncomfortable every time you passed it. He held, you remember seeing him if you lived in Washington? If you lived in Washington, you saw him. He held a sign up about clergy and about clergy doing things that they ought not be doing. And he did it for years before the rest of us were having that conversation because it had not hit the front page of the news. Was he in conversation even though no one else was listening? When he held this big sign up asking someone to listen. So these are the things when we ask that question, what does a productive conversation about race sound like? Sound like, we're going to get to that also. Sound. Do we actually hear it? Because sometimes the most productive conversations about race are the ones that you don't get a chance to hear because they don't have it in public spaces. So we talked about who and what does it include. Is it a productive conversation if you're only talking to like-minded people? So we both heard lots of different people from lots of different races, lots of different viewpoints. If we're honest about conversations about race, does that usually happen? Anyway.
No. You tend to gravitate towards people who are similar towards you. You're going to constantly be fighting with someone you're not going to want to talk to them on a regular basis, so that doesn't make sense. But then you end up just talking to each other about the same thing, agreeing on it, and moving on to the next topic.
So we tend to practice homosociality. We tend to surround ourselves with people who are similar to us in our class structure and our race structure, and our educational background, in our geography and our religious preferences or practices. And often those conversations don't include people of different races. Can you think of an example of where that actually happens? Where people actually come together across cohorts and engage in a conversation intentionally or accidentally. Last week, we talked a lot about accidental archives. A lot of things that happen productively happen accidentally. It's not always when people come together. Can you think of an example of where that might happen? So let me ask the question this way. Give me the room. I'm not going to call on you individually. As a room, pretend that you're on team A and there's a team over here that's team B. And let's say you're playing Family Feud. And instead of Steve Harvey asking you, a question about hair color or what are the 5 things that you would find in somebody's refrigerator, he decided to go deep and say, give me an example, 3 examples of when you find yourself in a cohort full of people that's very different, and it just so happens to be the case. Whether or not you're talking about race, give me an example of when that happens.
Classroom setting?
Classroom setting. Okay, we're going to interrogate that in a minute.
I can imagine concerts.
Concerts. Okay.
Or an airplane?
An airplane. Uh-huh.
Working in retail. Working in retail.
Working in retail. Okay. Anybody else?
I don't know if that's the example because it's the same party, but it's interesting to sit in on an actual caucus when they happen, you
Right.
know, just because they're different people from different camps, from different politicians having to come together and, you know, share their differing views on something.
And if you
in
have the
a very
benefit,
public-
I wish everyone would have the benefit of seeing a caucus because they are limited. They're only used in a small number of states. And you really do see democracy happen in an interesting way because there are people who are thrown together in a room. And you have to actually have dialogue. In some of the places you talked about, there is not necessarily dialogue. If you're on a plane, maybe you're next to someone who's chatty. If you're on the red eye, I know I take a red eye back to California very regularly, and I have a rule: no talking, no food, close your eyes right away, you know, just sleep for 4 hours so you can function on the other side of that. But you're not always talking, right? But are you still in conversation in some way because you're observing? So that's that part of that is part of conversation actually talking, or is part of conversation just being in a space where you can observe something? You're on a flight and you're traveling to Indiana, and you're on a flight with a number of people who are Mennonite. Something you don't see a lot in this region, but if you travel to certain parts of the world, you see. You may not be in conversation, but I guarantee you when you're on that small space with that group of people, you're learning something about it just by being with them. Concert. Are you in conversation?
Sometimes I think if something happens, say, I don't know, if there's a person next to you that's very outspoken, you can tend to join their conversation, and then the whole group of people, strangers, just start talking.
Sporting event would be similar, right? Are you in conversation? Sporting events are interesting because people all come together. I'm surprised no one mentioned this when I asked this question. That's often the first thing people mention. Boston is one of the most divided cities in the world. Red Sox Nation is something special. In a very divided city, that's one thing that people can agree on. Sometimes, kind of, sort of, on Thursday in late July. You know, it doesn't always happen, but sometimes that you can bring people together. A classroom. Now I say we're going to interrogate that because classrooms are interesting, aren't they? We're in a classroom right here. This is a diverse cohort, but it's people who are at a university. So is that, there's a certain amount of self-selection there, right? So when you're talking about having conversations that include lots of people, that's actually a challenge to find places. Yes.
I thought of like intentional activist or organizing spaces.
So is,
Yeah, people
Okay.
are talking.
people are talking about how diverse is it?
It depends.
Yeah. And if you're organizing, that often is a less diverse space because you're in agreement around the thing that you're the organizing principle is the thing that brings you together. And if you're engaged in a conversation about race, you're often doing it around a DEI frame, diversity, equity, inclusion. And often those are less diverse conversations, right? Because I always argued when my kids were young and they would have diversity night. And diversity night was really not that diverse. You know, I always say, if you want to call this like bring the brown people together night, let's call it that. Because that's usually what it was, is the brown people come together and talk about the education of the children. But it wasn't truly diverse. So when you're talking about bringing people together, part of that, what does a productive conversation sound like? The first thing we said is it includes lots of people. That's actually harder than it sounds. When people ask that question about intentionally people coming together who are a uniquely diverse cohort, the thing that I always think about is jury duty.
That's what the person.
Oh, winner, ding, ding, ding. William, thank you. Because it truly is randomly selected. And it is a very interesting experience. And you will find that you are in a room, in a jury pool, and usually in a courtroom, and usually in a courthouse. And every step you take to walk up to the courthouse, to go into the courthouse, to go in through the metal detectors at the courthouse, to go into the courtroom and then go into the jury deliberation room. And if you're chosen for the jury, then to go to the little strange room where you eat lunch. All of that is just diversity that is just thrown together. And you have to figure out how to communicate with each other. And I always wish that we could do something similar like that around problem solving or just around a conversation about identity in America to bring people together. Because when you do focus groups, that's generally what you're trying to do. And jury pools are one place where that happens in a very organic way. So how does one have productive conversations with people who will never occupy common ground? And is that important? And if that is important, why? So if we talked about the challenge of bringing people together, how do you, if it's hard to bring people together, how do you have a productive conversation with people who come from different spaces who might not agree? Let's assume that you can figure out how to bring them together short of creating a jury pool. And William, maybe you have an idea of what we're talking about here. How do you have a productive conversation with people? And we haven't defined what's productive yet, so let's leave that aside. With people who don't necessarily agree with each other, who don't occupy common ground, either physically in terms of geography or in terms of ideology. They don't occupy common ground. And why is it important to even try to do that? So let's start with the last part of that. Why is it important to try to do that?
Sometimes you might not agree, but you get a perspective of why they came to that conclusion. So we might not agree, but I do want to know what path you took to get there, what experiences or why you feel that way.
So
Because I might not know that at all from my
So out of
experience.
curiosity, out of respect, and in terms of elasticity in your own thinking. Like I might not agree with you, but I want to know something about you. Okay, that's something we probably should see more of in America right now. We don't see a lot of that. Were you going to add something? Okay, all right. So why, anyone else on why that might be important?
So that when you're in similar conversations in the future, you have a better grasp of how to understand like where other people are coming from. So if you've kind of done it before previously, you can kind of open up to new perspectives in future conversations like that.
Open up to new perspectives. Okay, if you were strategic, and let's say you were organizing and you were active, would you want to do that so you could make a bigger argument? Eric Liu does a wonderful seminar at the Aspen Institute, which is around making better arguments. And part of that is bringing people together for the idea of making a better argument. Like if you argue successfully, you need to know a little bit more about the competition. It's like, you know, Pepsi will try to interrogate Coke and vice versa, not because they plan to like give up Coke or Pepsi, but they want to know a little bit about the other side. One other suggestion on why it's important before we take on that other question. How do you have a productive conversation with someone you don't agree with?
Somebody said before, the listening part, which is something you have to, you know, it's not, I think when we're taught in debate class and stuff, it's like you should always be thinking about what you're going to say next, even when, you know, somebody's talking, and it's actually not thinking about what you're going to say next, but actually just listening, which is sometimes hard to do when you're, you know.
Because you, in part of engaging, and that's part of the balance, right? Part of engaging it is someone who is an interlocutor who spends much of my time interviewing people. That's a balance that I always have to think about. How am I an active listener, but at the same time, I have to participate in this, so I have to think 3 steps ahead about how I'm going to ask the next question. So you have to literally learn how to engage different parts of your brain, to be respectful to the conversation, to be an active listener, but at the same time, think about how you're going to engage in the conversation. Sometimes you can have a productive conversation by just lurking. And lurking is one of those things that, thank you for coming, safe travels. Lurking is one of those things that actually is useful in terms of conversation. It takes us to social media. Some of social media is about talking, but some of it is just lurking. I know that I am regularly exposed to other points of view that I don't engage in, but I follow a lot of people that I don't subscribe to their way of thinking, but I want to understand. As you were saying, I want to understand how they came to their way of thinking, what they, you know, what is their anthem, and what makes them feel like they need to sing it on a particular day. So if we're looking at the words in that sentence, what does a productive conversation sound like? What is a productive conversation? What is a conversation? And what does it sound like? So let's work backward from there. Maybe because I'm in audio, I said, what does a productive conversation sound like? Will you actually hear it? Now I'm saying that actually, would you hear it, but also metaphorically? Is it something that is spoken? Do we need to think about where we would find that conversation. So if you were trying to, again, let's go back to our game. Steve Harvey is in the room and asking, I need you to give me an example of a productive conversation. Where would you go to find it? Where do you think it happens? An example of a productive conversation. And if I work backward, how do we define that conversation? Where would you find it? I'll throw one out in the room. When I think about this, I think about sports. I think about sports in America right now. You have a lot of coaches who are of one cohort. We've learned a lot about that of late, particularly in the NFL and the NBA. That is a fairly homogeneous cohort. It is usually men who are coaching are usually white, and their assistant coaches are often white. If they're in the sports that are dominated by men, if they are in sports dominated by women, you of course see a little bit more diversity. But the coach usually matches the sport. More women in women's sports, more women in women's sports, more men in men's sports. You don't see a lot of gender diversity. But you see a lot of diversity in the overall field of play, right? And the cohort of coaches doesn't necessarily match the cohort of players in some of the big ticket sports, like baseball, like football, like basketball. Less so in places like hockey and other sports. Because people are all rowing in the same direction, singing the same anthem, working toward the same goal, and because they do it successfully, somewhere along there's a productive conversation about how they get along. Or is it possible that they get along by not having the conversation? I'm not answering the question, I'm asking. So is it that they get along and they work productively because they've had a productive conversation, or because they get along well by not actually having the conversation? I think it's probably more of the former, because I think at some point it's hard to avoid having some version of that conversation. So when you think about where do productive conversations happen, that was a job place conversation, right? It's a workplace conversation. Where do these conversations happen? Do they happen in dorm rooms? Do they happen in restaurants? Where is it that we would find a productive conversation? And what makes it productive? And that's the big word in the middle of it. That's the word that anchors the whole thing. What defines a productive conversation? Is it comfortable in a productive conversation? If everyone leaves and says, well, that felt good, is there?
Comfortable sometimes, because are you saying what you think other people want you to hear, or not saying what you think at all? I mean, it should be a little challenging.
So you should feel a little bit of indigestion if it's a productive conversation.
Or you're going to that group where you're just like-minded and reinforcing everybody's,
Is it a productive conversation if there are 10 people in the conversation and 7 of them didn't say anything? Is it a productive conversation? It's one of those, if the tree fell in the forest and no one heard it. Is it a productive conversation if it happened and there's no recording of it? No way to share what actually was productive of that in that conversation? Was it still productive?
I'd say yes, just because then if you have 10 people, they all get to talk, they all share their opinion, they're gonna go talk about it with somebody else. So even if it's not recorded, published, or anything like that, if you go, I went to an event and we discussed this, almost everyone here is probably gonna tell their friends later today, or call their parents and be like, hey, let me tell you what I did today. So it becomes productive and then it gets transferred on to the next person.
Is it a productive conversation if there are 10 people in the conversation and only 3 of them thought it was productive? And the other 7, let's say 3 of them thought it was productive, 3 of them thought it was all right, and 4 of them thought, that's the worst thing I've ever been a part of, I'm never doing this again. And that's the story that they tell. Oh my goodness, if you ever get this invitation, run for the hills. Do not go, it will be awful. Is that still a productive conversation? Tell me why.
I think so. I mean, it's, nothing's ever 100%. And if it's affecting some people and allow them to think differently about something or ask different questions, then yeah, I think so. You know, and in that conversation, it might not be productive for somebody, but they might have a conversation some other day that, you know, is. So I don't think you can have 100% all the time.
So you can't please everybody all the time.
No, I don't think people will take the same thing. Yeah, things. I think like, I don't know if it's a good example, but like I'm in a book club and not everybody feels the same way about the book or motivated, but there's been some books that have deeply affected people in that book club and they've gone on to learn something, do something, but it's different for everybody every time.
It's like what Emerson said, a mind exposed to a new idea never goes back to its original dimensions. So even though you don't agree with something, just exposure to something, again, that elasticity, you may not, and in fact, in the work that I do, I no longer use the term common ground. So I'm revealing something about myself. And it's not because I don't believe in common ground. It's not that I don't believe it's possible. I believe that in a fractured society right now, it's a little bit harder to ask people to occupy common ground. So instead, let's explore someone else's idea with the notion that you probably will retreat to your own. Shelby said, I think these situations are productive in that the conversation provides others something to consider. Their perspective may shift in some way and be reflected in future decisions. So that's similar to what we're hearing in the room. And since we see up there asking people to engage in Twitter, why don't we talk about what my mother calls the Twitter? Is it a productive conversation if no one is actually talking to each other? But people are actually espousing their ideas without talking to each other. They're talking past each other. They're throwing ideas out into the world, but not necessarily answering someone else. It is a cacophonous symphony. Is that still a conversation? You don't think so? Tell me why.
It might spark other conversation.
It might spark other conversations. Is it a conversation if it is a stream where people are engaging with each other in the comment stream? Kind of. Which part of it feels like a conversation and which part of it doesn't?
The responding. Yeah. If someone's commenting on something someone else said.
There's the thread that goes back and forth.
Yeah.
So if you want to have a productive conversation, and let's say we're in the Steve Harvey game again, and you want to say the three things that you need to actually set up based on the conversation that we've had. Not just what it needs to look like, but what are the parameters for creating a productive conversation? Think about where does it need to happen? Think about why does it need to happen? Think about when does it need to happen? All those where, when, why, how, and when. What are some parameters? If your job was to create a productive conversation, what would you want it to include or not include? When would it happen? How would it happen? I'll throw something out there. When I bring people together, I include food. We call it comfort food for a reason. People bring bread together, something naturally happens. In some cultures, when you arrive, the first thing they give you is bread and salt. There's just something about people coming together over food that is a moderating force. So I'll throw that out as my contribution. If you were trying to bring people together with the goal of having a productive conversation about a topic as prickly as race in America in the year 2022, what would need to happen? You should raise your hand even to scratch your head.
Sometimes like timely examples are important. Like if something's happening, you know, right now somewhere that you can react to and get help with the conversation.
There are moments. So George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd was probably a moment for a conversation. Election, an unfortunate moment, elections. Would COVID be a moment for that? The pandemic. Because there is common ground that's built into that, although we are all experiencing COVID in a different way. It is in some ways an us and them pandemic. And yet no one has been able to escape this in some way, no matter where you live in the globe. So timeliness. Anything else? Where should it happen? Should people be in the comfort of their homes, engaging online, on Zoom, or is it better if people are all together? 1 and 2. And then I'll come to you.
I think definitely it's better in the comfort of your home or in a comfort space. Because I definitely think if you're in a comfortable area or space, you're able to express yourself in a better way, better vocabulary, better sentences, than if you're in an uncomfortable space or around other people, like in a school building or a short box, when you could be on your living room couch with your people you're having a conversation with.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a minute.
I disagree with that. I was gonna say, I think that it should really happen everywhere, and it could happen everywhere when you have conversations about race, like serious in-depth conversations about race. It's not usually planned. You're not usually in your living room. It's usually something that like happens because of something else. Like, to go back to retail, for example, like I spent a lot of time working in a Starbucks. And the amount of times that you end up talking about race, whether it's with your coworkers or it's with customers, like especially June of 2020 when Black Lives Matter protests were happening, and that was all everyone wanted to talk about. Like to the point where Starbucks had to release like talking points to its baristas, because it was like, people are going to walk in and tell to you about race, and here's how you handle it, because that's not what you were expecting when you came to work today. But it creates an open conversation. I think that's important.
So that's interesting. The company anticipated that and helped you. There were a lot of people who didn't have that, who didn't have that kind of directive. So you're saying that it can happen when like you don't always get the invitation. Sometimes it's like the weather. It's like I didn't wear a coat. I wasn't expecting that. That can happen in terms of race. And yet I'm not sure you would disagree with each other, but it's possible that you're both right. So I learned something during COVID about the importance of, or the possibility that people are perhaps more willing to engage differently if they're in their comfort zone. We normally do our work through the Race Car Project out in the world. I spent a lot of time out on the road. During COVID, we started doing a lot of work in Zoom. Some of it intimate, some of it quite large. We had a couple of Zoom sessions we had one that had 6,000 people, with a large corporation. And I thought this was going to be flat. People would not be willing to engage. They'd see small faces and small boxes, and it wouldn't work. And even though they were seeing small faces and small boxes, they were sitting in there that perhaps something unlocked in them, because they were with their favorite coffee mug, and they were sitting on the chair that they loved, and they were listening to the music, and they were looking at the west-facing window that they normally don't get to see when they're at work. And we found that our conversations actually deepened. Now, how much of it was because it was June 2020? Because we had those two things. We had the pandemic, we had twin pandemics, and the summer of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and Elijah McClain. And there were lots of things that were happening that racialized our conversation in general, and disparities in terms of access to tests and access to vaccines. There were lots of things that were happening, but it's possible that the comfort of home did contribute to that in some way. And we have William saying, to me, conversation equals a notion of two people in exchange of ideas and information. I like the etymology of converse, which is with and turn. A conversation is productive when a person gets something of value from the exchange. I love that, get something of value from the exchange. Thank you, William. Since people have different notions of what is valuable, what makes a conversation productive will depend on the people involved. And that's a wonderful way to put it, because I put food on the table. Some people could say free lunch. That was productive. I'm glad I came. But even though they may not have engaged in the conversation, as Amy was saying, they may be leaving with food for thought. They may not have agreed, but they may be leaving with food for thought. So a lot of the work that I do revolves around who, what, where, when, and why. And I wanted And if I'm invited back, I would do a longer version of this, but normally I do a writing exercise and I do a whole series of writing exercise with each one taking a different form about who, what, where, when, and why. And how productive conversations are often built on bricks of the who, what, where, when, and why. Those are the bricks for a productive conversation. The who, the where, the when, the what, the why. Since I do work around 6-word stories, the time that we have left, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to invite you to participate in this conversation. Some of you have instruments of writing. If you don't, you have your phones. And so you can open up the notes section and you can take them. And if you can go to the last slide. Most of you know about the Race Car Project, so I didn't go through the introductory slides. If you don't, I can talk just a little bit about that. Lulu, do you, maybe for the benefit of a few people who have been there, I run something called the Race Car Project. I collect 6-word stories. I've been doing it over time. It started with postcards. I'm just going to talk through it and you can click through it. And over time, we created a website. So most of the postcards that we get now come to us not through the postcards, but through the website. And as you see, we learn a lot about people. The people that are actually in our archive are real individuals. They're not all stories. We've collected 500,000 stories and over 12 years. And so now we can go to the end of this, the who, what, where, when, and why. So when people choose to send us their 6-word stories, they determine what's important to them. And what's interesting to me about this archive is in the 6-word stories, you will find big events that happen, like the things we've mentioned, COVID, George Floyd, elections, natural disasters, border issues, the Muslim ban, big stories that top of the fold headlines in the newspaper. But mostly what people write to us about are the things that ricochet off those stories. They're things that have nothing to do with those stories. They write about very intimate things, what the world thinks of them, what the world thinks of their children, how they send their children into the world, how they engage with their boss. I cut my hair and the world sees me differently, how they get to and from work, very intimate things, the food that they eat, the number of people who write to us about rice as a part of their diet and how they are identified through their pursuit of rice, the decision to whether or not they want to continue eating rice, realizing that when they leave one part of the world and go to another, we had rice this way, they eat rice that way. It's interesting to me that you can view the world through such an intimate lens. And so what I want to ask you to do is to think about, if you were to tell, and I'm putting each of you on the spot, and we have about 23 minutes, so this is not perfect. Each of you choose, I'm not going to tell you which one of these vectors for inquiry that you would begin your story with. And you give me a 6-word story about a who, a what, a where, a when, or a why. So these are perhaps not your stories. They're stories based on where you start. So where? Is it where something happened? Is it where you feel a certain thing? Whatever it is, that's your portal, is where. Why? Who, what, where, when, why? That might be your portal. When something happens. So you choose which one it is, and you're going to tell me why you chose, you're going to tell me what that 6-word story is and why you chose it. If we were doing this in a formal classroom, what we would do is you would have an actual writing assignment. It would begin with the 6 words. As a writer myself, if I tackle a difficult subject, and as a columnist and a writer and an author, I write about race, so it's always difficult and prickly and common. This is where I begin writing. I learned this early on as a writer. If you can break something down into one sentence, you've tackled it. Now, that doesn't mean that you will stick with that hypothesis, but if you can take something very complicated and break it down to one sentence, it means that you understand it. I learned that early on as a writer for the Washington Post. The first time I worked for the Washington Post, I'm now a columnist for the Washington Post, I came to Washington, D.C. a long time ago as a young reporter for the Washington Post. And Donald Graham, who was then the publisher of the Washington Post, used to walk around the newsroom always wearing a ratty blue cardigan sweater. Looked sort of like something that Mr. Rogers would wear. And he would walk through the newsroom, which was very unusual because most publishers don't own the newsroom. Publishers usually are ensconced in a office suite somewhere very high above the newsroom. But Donald Graham was unusual in that he would walk the newsroom with his hands behind his back, and he would lean in to see what you were working on. Hey, kiddo, what are you writing? And if you were writing for the front page of the paper, you would most certainly get a visit from him. Hey, kiddo, what are you looking at? What are you writing? And he would look over your shoulder and he'd want to know what you were writing, and you would engage in conversation with the publisher, which was a really big deal as a young reporter. You're talking to the publisher. But when you're having that conversation, you could talk yourself off the front page of the paper if you were too parenthetical in your answer. Because he'd leave and he'd think, she doesn't have it. She's still working it out in her head. She can't figure it out yet. But if you could use that 30 seconds when he would just have a drive by your desk to explain to him that you understood the story, sort of like you've heard of the concept of an elevator pitch. You know, how long does an elevator ride take? It was 33 seconds. You have 33 seconds to sell, somebody on your great idea, sort of like that. And I learned as a writer, it would not just help me pitch a story to the publisher, but help me understand something. And so when I tackle something, there are two things that I generally do with a difficult writing assignment. I still try to condense it to one sentence. The other thing I do is, because I'm still intimidated as a writer all these years later, is I will often write in the email frame. Instead of writing in Word or Pages, I will pick up my device and open an email, and I find that I can write in my voice if I pretend that I'm writing an email to a friend. And it comes out, and then I will move it into Word and fix it up and fix all the grammar. But I just find that, hey girl, this is what I think about this. And then I'll just, I'm off to the races as opposed to starting. So that's a secret of how I tend to write, but it begins with one sentence. So take a minute. Are you a who, a what, a where, a why, or a when? What is your 6 words? You can do it in your phone, or you can do it on that. I should have brought pads for you.
There are some around.
Oh, okay. If anyone wants to do it, I'm tactile, so I like to write things. And can we call up the chat? So if anybody is, we want to make sure that we include. So for Shelby and William, we're hoping that you're participating also in thinking of a who, a what, a where, a why, or a when. Okay, so William, I'm calling on you just because we can see yours. Everybody else's is in their pads and their paper. His 6 words are white dad, brown kids, no guidebook. Very evocative. And if, William, you want to tell us which one of the vectors for inquiry you chose on that, I don't want to, I can guess, but I don't want to. Was it a who, a what, a where, a why, or a when? You want to just pop that in the chat? A who. Okay, that's what I thought. So that tells us about who you are. And can you tell us why you decided to walk through that doorway and talk about who as opposed to where, what, why, and when? while we're waiting on William. We'll keep an eye out for him. Shelby, I hope you will send us yours also. Amy, your pen is down, so I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, I hope I understood you.
First of all, tell us which vector you chose. Where?
My 6 words were finding understanding.
During moments of celebration. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, there have been times when I've been invited to either a wedding or a christening or some special event where I was the only one who looked like to be there. And it wasn't in a moment of like hostility or like had to ask, like, you know, it was finding understanding and understanding people better in their moments of joy or their moments of celebration. And I learned a lot that time.
Can you give us an example if you don't mind?
No, I was invited to a friend's wedding, and she is African American, and her father's background is Kenya and from Kenya. And so a lot of the celebration was about their culture, you know, their history. It was also just felt like a safe environment to ask questions or to find out more about their experiences, and also to understand just some of the people that, you know, you're attending with. It seemed like a safe space to just kind of better understand like their experiences, how they you know, view things, and not in a moment of angst or, you know, but like just understand their joys in their life. So
It was very organic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Lola, what were your 6 words?
I wrote down and I scratched it and just I kept on deleting my thoughts. But I did think about where, and usually I just kept coming back to classrooms because I feel like that's where I had most of my productive conversations. Just in spaces where you're just allowed the voice to talk. And I think the only place that I've felt that was in classrooms. I didn't know how to like phrase that.
So classrooms are, so think about your 6 words. We're going to give you a little bit more time to think about how you would string them together. What were your 6 words?
I chose the how vector. Now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know if it applies specifically to conversation, but just, I guess, the topic of race. I wrote listening to the least heard voices, because that's what has helped me in my ongoing journey. Just when you benefit from something, there's a lot you're missing. And people who don't benefit know more about how people do, you know. So I've just sought out those perspectives and that aren't reflected. And that's how I've learned a lot.
One more time, listening to the
least heard voices.
I like that. I like that. And I appreciate it, because one of the things that we realize in the work that we do is there are often people, when we do work with institutions or corporations or schools, or we work with the Justice Department, the military, we usually try to find different portals. That word a lot, portals for conversation, because actual conversation, the kind that we talked about, 2 people in an exchange of ideas, or a group of people in an exchange of ideas, is not a natural setting for everybody. It's not where people are naturally comfortable. And so there are people who will never raise their hand. And there are people who will always raise their hand. And there are people who, when prompted or called upon, will uncomfortably not raise their hand, but participate. But there are some voices who you will miss in a traditional conversation. So we usually try to figure out how people can participate in different ways by sending something in, sometimes through art. We have done things where we've allowed people to bring an artifact to, you know, I just can't get up in the room and tell the story, but I'm going to bring this hot comb that my grandmother used to fix our hair on Sundays before church. And just having the artifact, the physical thing with them, even if they can't tell that story, adds to the story of their community, particularly when we do community work. We ask people to bring in something that says something of your community. So I really, really appreciate that. We're going to go back to William, who said that some people make assumptions about others based on skin color. As someone who has had a different experience from my kids, I don't always know how to support them when they encounter difficult race-based situations. This is very common for people who raise children who don't look like them. Very common for people who raise children who have inherited a very different world than them. And what I appreciate about what William said is that there's no guidebook. There's often no guidebook. And one of the reasons we're asking these questions is if you look up, if you type in how to have a productive conversation, you're going to find about 200 Google responses to that. And some of them will reflect some of the things that we've talked about. But I guarantee you, when you find yourself trying to put together that cohort for the conversation, when you find yourself in the room trying to have the conversation, you will feel like you don't have a guidebook, even though you've read a lot about that. Shelby says, using the how and who vector, I have often been the only voice in my intersectional cultures in many spaces. I've tried to both convey and connect with others the dual nature of what that's like as an educator. So we haven't talked a lot about intersectional spaces, but a lot of the work that we're doing really does speak to this notion of intersectionality, and that we're not one thing, we're often many things, but the world often places us in one box and tries to define us in that way. What were your 6 words?
College student, prestigious university, mostly white.
Say more about which vector was it?
Who?
Who?
And
Okay.
I guess you could
Because I was
touch a
going to say
little
could be
bit.
where, but
Yeah, you can touch a little bit on where too, I guess. But I said that, I said who because the who is mostly white.
Mhm.
It's most of my classes are white students. There's 1 or 2 blacks, there's 1 or 2 Latinos, Latinas, but most of it is white. I think in my time here, I probably had, off the top of my head, I can remember I've had 1 black professor. And it's mostly white.
Mhm. That's not unusual. There's a statistic that I can't cite right now, but I could, invite you to look it up. Most college students will leave without ever having a black professor. And if you have 1, you're lucky, and if you have 2, you're a unicorn. And if you're outside of an HBCU culture. So you did who, and you could say it's a where,
Yeah.
but you could also say that's a why
Okay, I didn't think of that.
or how, which was not part of this who, when, where, why. You got how to that. Why does that happen, or how does that happen? Or how do you change that, and why can't it change? Or are you comfortable with that? And why would we want to change it? Some people would say, because there are some who would say it's fine just the way it is. But it's something that now that you've put it down, I guarantee you will think about it more. Because there's something about putting your truth in your hands and putting it on paper, and it now will live in you in a different way. And I hope you're okay with it, because you'll be more aware of that. And that can be a good thing, or it can be a discomfort. But we've also learned that a little discomfort is part of a productive conversation. What were your 6 words?
Yeah, mine encompasses both when and where, when I think about it. I said, is resisting violence the American dream? I was at home during COVID, during the pandemic, and I'd come back from being here at a school that had taught me so many different perspectives, and I found myself in a space where my parents disagreed with a lot of what I was saying, and we had very organic dinner table conversations after we had watched the news and a lot of what was happening with Black people being killed by police officers, and my dad was a police officer, and there was just a lot to grapple with there. And so when I was thinking about what constituted a productive conversation, I was thinking about what space that takes place in, and when that was for me such a pivotal moment.
Where are you from?
I'm from South Jersey.
Okay. So if you were able to have a conversation like that with a police officer, you are also rare. Because when we talk about productive conversations around race, and we talked about who's missing, who's often missing? We're often talking about police, but we're rarely talking with police. And there are lots of reasons for that. Some of it is protocol, some of it is union protocol, some of it is workplace protocol, but there are conversations around policing that often don't include police. Is that a productive conversation if you're having a conversation about policing in America that does not include police? I'm asking a question. Is it a productive conversation if the people who are at the center of that conversation are not?
No, it's the same thing when you talk about abortion and women's rights. You don't have any women in the room. It directly affects them, even though they're often seen as the bad guy, it directly affects them. You should be including them.
So that, first of all, that is a unique perspective to be able for you to actually have that conversation. It sounds like you were saying you don't always agree, but most people who don't agree necessarily with policing aren't able to have that conversation. People who agree with policing and think nothing needs to change, they still aren't able to have that conversation because police are usually not able to be a part of that conversation. I was interested in violence is resisting violence the American dream. Why did you settle on those words?
I kind of framed it at that because a lot of the conversation I was having was surrounding violence perpetuated by police officers. And, you know, and a lot of my dad's talking points were, this is something that has just been going on, and it's something that like is ingrained in the police system, especially for people of color. And I think I was interrogating him on like why that has been, and is it supposed to be like that? And, that was kind of at the core of the conversation, I think, for him when we were talking about that.
Do you feel like those conversations evolved? Were you heard?
Yes, yeah.
And did you hear him?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's going back to what Amy said, the elasticity, like you may not agree, but you understand a different perspective.
Yeah, I think I learned a lot because it was a conversation that we hadn't really had before, and it was that moment that had kind of, or those moments during that time that had kind of really triggered my ability to be able to really listen and hear stories and things that I had not were not shared before.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate your honesty. We only have a few more minutes, so the last two stories. You want to share 6 words?
Yeah, I said learned what wealth is in college.
Learned what wealth is in college. So what door did you walk through? Which vector did you use?
I used where in college, but I think it could also be like a when, like kind of coming of age, you kind of like fully realize.
And what did you learn about wealth?
Well, I used to think like someone being rich was like they have a big house, like maybe a couple nice cars, that sort of thing. But then I come to college at a private university where it is expensive to go here. And then I hear people talking about owning multiple houses in different countries, owning horses, like things that I would have never even thought about. And like, that's what wealth is, not just having a nice house.
So can I, we'll get to yours in a minute. I know we were trying time, but can I give you something to think about? One of the things, I think about wealth a lot and about work ethics and worth ethics and value and valuation. And one of the things that I've come to learn in this work is that your story is part of your wealth. And if your story is interesting, it has even more value. And that if the road that you had to walk was steeper or craggier than everybody else's, every rock that you had to overcome, every travail that you had to face adds valuation to your story. And so when we think of wealth, just in terms of what people own, it's a narrow definition of wealth. When you're in a college environment, you have an interesting opportunity for wealth acquisition in terms of the kinds of stories that you can surround yourself and absorb. And as someone who is probably about 40 years older than you or more, I can tell you that it's harder to acquire that kind of wealth in terms of story absorption as you get older and go out into the world, because the world that you encounter becomes more narrow. So I'm just saying that in terms of wealth, there's another way of thinking, about wealth, that the notion of a wealth of ideas and a wealth of experiences. I hope that in the time that you spend here, you have a chance to learn about that too, because college is the most opportune moment for that kind of thing. Thank you for sharing this experience. I'm gonna close this out.
So I did wear, and my 6 words were, you are allowed to be here.
You are
Allowed to be here.
You are allowed to be here.
What I was thinking about specifically was very similar to what you said, going to especially talking about price, and going to a private university that's very expensive, that's usually out of reach for a lot of people. I've noticed, at least in myself and a lot of people that I talk to, it's sort of like, did I really deserve to come to this school? Did I really deserve to meet these people? Do I deserve this? And just sitting back and being like, these are your accomplishments. You have achieved them, and you are allowed to be here. You are welcome here, and you should be proud of that.
So it's interesting that, because you often think about outlier behavior, you don't necessarily, we often ascribe that to people who are underrepresented. And a lot of the programs and programmatic efforts in schools aimed at people who are underrepresented often are aimed at people of color and people who are manifestly underrepresented because of the way they present in the world. And there are pockets of people who feel underrepresented for lots of different reasons. And sometimes it has to do with wealth, sometimes it has to do with religion, whether you're a fundamentalist or whether you're Wiccan, whatever it is that that you subscribe to, you might feel like you're underrepresented. And so when we're talking about that productive conversation, that's one of the things when we talk about different viewpoints. How do you make sure, or voices that aren't heard, how do you make sure that you're including lots of people? And I said that I would try in this work to, in the 5 sessions that we did, to spotlight the blind spots. It's interesting that what you're presenting, in the last moments that we have together, are blind spots that all of us have. And I hope that in the time that we've been together, that's the thing that I can leave you with, is the importance of understanding blind spots. I'm a storyteller, I'm a journalist. I'm thinking about this all the time. I will admit that I did spend enough time thinking about it in my prior world. The work that I do makes me really think about what I don't know and the power of saying I don't know. And that is a very powerful place to start, is the idea that I don't know as much as I want to know. And there's power in saying I don't know. But if I follow that with the curiosity to try to learn as much as I can and absorb as much as I can, so that when I leave, I am wealthy. When I leave this earth, I'm wealthy. Maybe not in terms of my bank account, but definitely in terms of the stories that I've surrounded. Thank you very much. We'll continue, but the talk says that it's time to go. Shelby and William, thank you very much for joining us. If you want to officially send your 6 words to the Race Car Project, you can do that and officially get in the archive at theracecarproject.com. It has been really wonderful to be here at American University. I am your friend and literally your neighbor, and quite literally your neighbor. I think some of you may have knocked at my door on Halloween. We had very few kids, but lots of college students who came to our door this year on Halloween. So I hope that this is the beginning of a wonderful friendship. And Amy, we'll continue to talk about really cool things that we think will come in the future. Thanks to all of you.